Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dive right into a mostly forgotten chapter of history and honestly, fundamentally reframe everything you thought you knew about the timeline of North America. Picture this. Imagine a continent already filled with millions of people, featuring massive, bustling cities stretching from coast to coast. It really forces us to stop and ask a pretty difficult question. When did American history actually begin, and why do our traditional timelines always seem to start so incredibly late? Well, let's look at the myth versus the reality. Long before 1776 or any European colonization, there was absolutely no empty wilderness here. History actually began thousands of years earlier. This was a landscape humming with hundreds of distinct, fully realized nations. We're talking about groups with their own complex languages, intricate governments, and generations of brilliant agricultural mastery. That brings us to Section 1, Earthworks in Great Cities, the people who shaped the earth. Across eastern North America, the Hopewell tradition created this massive, frankly mind-blowing exchange network. Archaeologists have uncovered copper from the Great Lakes, shells from distant coasts, and get this, obsidian all the way from the Rocky Mountains. Ancient North America was connected by these vast, sophisticated highways of trade, where ideas and goods literally traveled thousands of miles. Now, what is so incredible about this number is that it represents the peak population of Cahokia. Nearly 1,000 years ago, right near present-day St. Louis, Cahokia was a thriving metropolis built around the enormous Monk's Mount. To put that into perspective, this was a city that rivaled the biggest European capitals of its entire era. While Cahokia was an undeniable powerhouse, its population did eventually decline. The exact reasons? Well, it's kind of like a giant puzzle that's heavily debated today. It was likely a compounding mix of environmental pressures, political shifts, resource scarcity, and conflict. But here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. The people themselves didn't just disappear. Actually, scratch the idea of them vanishing altogether. Their descendants adapted and thrived. Moving right along to Section 2, Alliances and Invisible Enemies, the East and a Silent Disaster. Up in the Northeast Woodlands, we see the rise of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. This was a powerful, highly organized alliance uniting several nations through a deeply entrenched system of diplomacy and collective decision-making. They were never just passive observers. When colonization kicked off, they actively negotiated, they formed strategic alliances, and they fought fiercely to protect their sovereignty. But European arrival brought an invisible enemy that couldn't be fought with diplomacy: disease. With absolutely no previous exposure to illnesses like smallpox, epidemics totally devastated these communities. And when a population rapidly declines, a society loses its core pillars. They lost their farmers, their leaders, parents and children. They lost entire generations of vital knowledge. Yet, despite this silent, unimaginable disaster, these nations survived. Let's head west for Section 3, Nations of the Plains, Adaptation and Resistance. The story of the Great Plains is a story of lightning-fast transformation. It was a real game-changer. The very moment the horse arrived, native peoples masterfully adapted, completely revolutionizing hunting, trade, and warfare. This sparked the rise of incredibly dominant forces like the Comanche and the Lakota. But as U.S. expansion pushed westward, bringing with it broken treaties and stolen land, these nations mounted a fierce defense, which culminated in historic, legendary stands like the Battle of Little Bighorn. Now on to Section 4, the people who remained, survival in the Southwest. Centuries before European arrival, the Ancestral Puebloans built remarkable, stunning stone cities and cliff dwellings. And guess what? They didn't just vanish either. Their direct descendants are the modern Pueblo peoples living in the Southwest today, perfectly connecting an ancient past straight to the present. And this brings us to a really profound truth. Native history is not the story of a people who disappeared. Far from it. It's the story of a people who endured the unimaginable. They survived devastating diseases, they survived brutal wars, forced removals, and systematic attempts to erase their cultures and languages. Through all of that, they adapted, they remained, and they continued. Which brings us to our final segment, Section 5, Who Really Built America? The Final Truth. So it forces us to ask one last time, who really built America? Was it just the settlers arriving on boats, the revolutionaries, the pioneers pushing west? The answer is so much richer and more complex than what we're usually taught. Because when Europeans arrived, they absolutely did not walk into an empty, untouched wilderness. They entered a world that was already wildly alive. The land had already been engineered, cultivated, and shaped by thousands of years of rich indigenous history, complex politics, and massive, thriving cities. And that story definitely did not end with colonization. Native nations are still here today. They are still speaking their original languages. They are still protecting their unique cultures. The history of America is equally the story of the incredibly resilient people who were already here. The survival of these ancient nations sets the stage for a hugely tumultuous chapter of global history, that exact moment European ships arrived and two deeply established worlds finally collided. But knowing what you know now, I want you to ask yourself, was the arrival of Europeans really the beginning of the American story, or just its most violent plot twist? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the timeline and keep learning.